Michael Zikaras from Melbourne, Australia, and no one wants to hear me. They want to hear your accent. First of all, thank you so much for joining us. And second of all, what are the rules and the laws and all those regulations in Australia? Is it a pro-cannabis country or not?
Firstly, thank you very much for speaking to me today. Cannabis in Australia, it's had quite a similar path to the United States, albeit a little bit slower. Since 2016 in Australia, it wasn't legalized, but it was decriminalized and made a Schedule 8 drug so that doctors had a certain pathway, a very strict pathway, to be able to prescribe medicinal cannabis to the patients in Australia. Yeah, the stigma is still quite apparent, but it's fastly becoming more and more acceptable. As a alternate, form of medicine. It's treated as a last line of medicine here in Australia in the medical system, which is still, a little bit of a way to go, but we're getting there one step at a time. But socially, it's become, quite accepted in Australia, particularly as the dangers with other, drugs and alcohol become more apparent.
Well, in comparison to opioids and alcohol, it's really a no-brainer for a lot of people who understand how it works and what it does to your mind and your body, and how, we all have this endocannabinoid system in all of us that kind of dictates our neurotransmitters in our mind and our pain threshold and all that stuff. And you can't you can have different laws, but you can't all humanity has the same innards. You know what I'm saying? We all have an endocannabinoid system. Mammals all have an endocannabinoid system. And that's one of the reasons why there are some products out there, CBD-based products, especially that work on pets and animals. And that makes sense if you understand, again, how the system works. But let's go back to some of the diagnosed um, um, challenges for people to get qualified to use it medicinally. One is chronic pain. I can certainly relate to that. The other is cancer. And I believe, but I want to ask, has epilepsy or seizures entered into this? Because that's one of the things that I know for sure people have used it and they completely control the seizure.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's probably about almost 3,000 authorised prescribing doctors in Australia. I speak to a number of them quite regularly, and a number of them are treating people for indications and symptoms like seizures. The main primary conditions are really around sleep, pain, depression, and anxiety. But the subsets amongst them, we're seeing some very, very positive results, and we're seeing a lot of doctors go from slight skeptics to advocates now quite quickly.
Wow, that's awesome. That's great. The other comparison that I found when I looked up a little bit about your country was that you've got a federal government, but you also have individual state laws. And sure enough, just like we have here in the States, there's a difference between the federal laws and the state laws, and it's really up to the states to dictate whether or not it's going to be accepted and legal, correct?
Yeah, correct. So we've got our federal government and our state governments. Federally, the cannabis was decriminalised, and we're able to use it for medical purposes. But there are still some state laws that are a little bit inconsistent in terms of prescribing, dispensing, and things like that. We're going through a number of changes at the moment, particularly when it comes to compounding flour, where a pharmacist actually puts it in the jar. But a good example of where the discrepancies are is Tasmania, a little state in Australia,
Mhm.
separate from the mainland, is the only state at the moment where you're allowed to drive a vehicle with THC in your system. Everywhere in Australia, it's illegal, which is quite a contentious issue at the moment,
How do
considering a
they
lot of the
how,
traditional medicines.
and how do they tell that you're driving under the influence of THC? Is there a test that they
There's
do?
correct. There's roadside testing, and then if that tests positive, they do a secondary test. So
But hang on, so this is one of the biggest challenges in the States, as you know, especially in legal states. Everybody's concerned about driving under the influence. However, it's driving while impaired. And that's really the biggest X factor here. Can you operate a vehicle not being impaired and still have THC in your system, which you know stays 30 days? So is the test a blood
Correct.
test, or is it a swab, or is it, count the do the alphabet backwards or something ridiculous like that?
Yeah, it's a swab. It's a mouth oral test. So, and you're correct. It does stay in your system for a number of days, and people that had been impaired a day or two ago, but were no longer impaired, are being being charged. So it's quite contentious here, considering you look at the sort of the wide gamut of other medications that people are driving under the influence on. So
Right.
very topical in Australia at the moment.
Do they have Robitussin or dextromethorphan for like bronchitis? They do, right? Now, is
They do,
that
correct.
a medicine that you can go into a drugstore and buy it over the counter, or do you have to show an ID of having it over a 21? Because that's what's happening here in the States. And I've explained to people, I'm like, Robitussin gets you high, okay? And yet nobody gives it a second thought that you could be operating a vehicle under the influence of Robitussin, right?
Correct. Correct. And it's the same here in Australia. There are certain medicines that if they're under a certain strength,
Yeah.
you can just get over the counter, but they could contain, drugs in them. And then you've got the stronger or the bigger strength medications that you either need a prescription for, or you can only get from, the pharmacist behind the counter.
Right. It's fascinating to me because we speak the same language. Sounds a lot different, but we speak the same language. And yet we were both part of the colonial, you had colonial occupation back at the turn of the 20th century, and no taxation without representation here in the 18th century when they came over. Columbus, and not Columbus, but all the people came over from Europe to immigrate into the United States. We forgot we had open borders. Let's not get into that. Let's not talk about the politics, but talk about the politics in Australia just for a second, because how do you get laws changed if you don't like the law? Because here in the States, they have signatures, and and you get enough signatures, you get a question on the ballot, and if the ballot passes at an election, then it becomes law. Or the actual elected officials have the opportunity to create new laws too. How does it work in Australia, especially in some of those states that don't allow it being legalized at all?
Yeah, so it's similar. We have people want to put forward a law. They put forward a bill that goes through our parliaments and goes through the voting system, and then if it passes, it becomes law. But we've got laws being introduced enormously regularly, and it's getting kind of crazy because they sort of don't repeal laws; they just add more and more laws. So. But certainly in Australia, there is a growing swell of advocacy. There is a pro-cannabis party. There are a number of the mainstream parties that use cannabis as a way to win votes.
Yeah.
The Labor Party in Victoria, in our state, when there was an election a few years ago, the candidate was in a cannabis plantation talking about legalization. He then got in, and nothing happened. So we see that a lot. A lot of sort of political talk for political gain, not for the benefit of patients and the public in Australia.
And so it becomes law, and you've got so wait, let's go back to something you said. What's the name of the pro-cannabis political party in Australia?
Cannabis Australia. So Cannabis
That's
Australia
too
Party.
easy.
Yeah, yeah,
Okay,
yeah,
that's a true. That's
yeah. And,
crazy.
and look, I'm a obviously a big fan of those sort of smaller parties that are purely representing cannabis. But I think for me, I think the big changes will happen when these policies are managed internally within the big parties. So if Labor and Liberal If they're really talking about providing access and getting the benefits of the plant to the public, then they need to wave the flag a lot more than what they're doing and just make it happen.
Yeah.
It's the longer we leave it, the more archaic sort of it kind of feels, particularly when you're seeing the benefits that the patients in Australia are getting.
Fantastic. And I know you're in the industry in an ancillary form. Why don't you explain what you do, what your company does, and let our audience understand that you actually can make a living in the cannabis space in Australia?
Yeah, absolutely. So I got in quite early in Australia about 5.5 years ago. I was part of an organisation that opened the first few clinics and dispensaries, and now I'm working for an organisation called Cannim. And we provide quality, medicine to the Australian market, whether it be to brands or whether it be, white label products. And we've also got our own range of medicinal cannabis products. So we're supplying about 25% of, product into Australia.
Right. So in the States, flower is still king. It's at least half the market. People go in, and of course, the uneducated consumers that they are walk in, they look at the highest percentage of THC, and that's the product they want. And somebody has to educate those people on the fact that just because it has a high percentage of THC does not mean it's going to get you as high as another product or less high than another product. The terpenes kind of dictate the impact and the effect of how it all fits together. Is flower still king in Australia?
It is. But it's when it first started, the medicinal cannabis program back a few years ago, oil was king, but for a very short time. There were very few flower products in market. Then all of a sudden the industry just boomed. We went from having 5 flower products in market to I think there's over 700 now. So flower is absolutely king, but we're seeing more and more vaporizers come into the market, the vape pens and gummies as well. They're fastly becoming more and more popular. So oil is still popular, and it's really depending on the person's condition from a medical perspective as well. If they need that quick onset, flower is always going to be key. But if they want that longevity of the effect, and they can afford to have the onset come on a little bit later, then an edible or oil, is the way to go. So, doctors treat it case by case. But flower is certainly, the most popular of the formats.
And when you have states that have different rules from the feds, are they at least allowing interstate commerce from legal states to illegal states? How does that work? Or do they say
Yeah, so
no?
there's no real illegal state with medicinal cannabis in Australia now. So all
Okay,
states you're allowed to prescribe, but
okay,
there's some laws that say that if your prescription is from this state, you can only get it dispensed from a pharmacy from this state.
gotcha.
So there's little nuances like that, and as I mentioned before, there's driving, differences where the rest of Australia aren't allowed to drive. Under the influence of medicinal cannabis, but in Tasmania you can, and that we see that as being progressive.
Okay, and since we're talking about the driving, do you guys are you driving on the right side or the left side of the road?
We drive on the left-hand side of the
The
road.
left side. Okay, so there's still a little
Yeah,
Brit, a little the old
and the
empire.
right-hand side of the car.
There you go. That's right. I understand.
I think I messed up. Did you know there's a place that covers all the cannabis news you need? Welcome to Pro Cannabis Media, your go-to for all things cannabis. PCM is the CNBC of weed, bringing you the latest news and talk shows with a twist. We've got 16 state correspondents and multimedia journalists from around the US and Canada.
Hey everybody, it's Brandon Jones with Big Green Distribution with the Missouri Cannabis Report.
I'm Karen Black from Greenfinger Consulting with the Arizona Cannabis Report.
I'm Amy Carter from Michigan Weedsters.
Andrew Behringer here reporting from Washington, D.C.
Debbie Fazy with the Canadian Toke of the Week.
It all started back in 2018 when founder Jimmy Young kicked off the In the Weeds podcast. His mission? documenting the fight to end cannabis prohibition. Fast forward to today, and we've got Cannabis Coast to Coast with Elena Pinto, delivering the nation's only TV-style cannabis news show.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Cannabis Coast to Coast News, Pro Cannabis Media's weekly roundup of the news from the industry. I'm Elena Pinto.
As of August 2024, PCM has racked up over 1.2 million views and 14.5 million impressions on our YouTube channel. With 15,000 subscribers and growing, our reach is spreading like wildfire. PCM's website, YouTube, Rumble, Discord, Roku, Twitch, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Apple Podcasts, and even our very own PCM TV app. Get your cannabis news fix with Pro Cannabis Media. We're here to keep you informed and entertained. Stay tuned and stay lifted.